have you ever stopped and thought about just how impossible the Indian independence movement actually was? I mean, really think about it. On one side, you've got the most powerful empire in human history, and on the other, a massive subcontinent with hundreds of millions of people who are deeply divided by class, by caste, by religion, and by language. How in the world do you get all of those incredibly diverse people to push in the exact same direction? It's an absolutely fascinating puzzle.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into India's multi-decade journey to independence, but we're going to look at it through a very specific prism, because what you quickly realize when you dig into the history is that this wasn't just one single monolithic movement. It was actually a kaleidoscope of different groups. They were all experiencing colonial oppression in their own unique ways, and honestly, they were all imagining the concept of freedom very differently. So let's dive into this.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll cover 1. The spark of resistance. 2. Differing visions of freedom. 3. Salt and civil disobedience. 4. The limits of unity. And 5. Forging a collective identity. All right, let's jump right into part 1, the spark of resistance. To really understand the rise of mass nationalism in India, we have to ground ourselves in the incredibly grim reality that the subcontinent was facing right after World War I. 12 to 13 million. That is a staggering number. According to the 1921 census, that's how many lives were lost to famines and a massive influenza epidemic. During the war, defense spending had skyrocketed, taxes went up, and prices literally doubled. It brought extreme hardship to everyday people. Plus, villages were absolutely furious over the forced recruitment of soldiers. People had really hoped that the end of the war would bring some relief, but instead, crops failed and sickness just swept across the land. It was out of this immense shared despair that a totally new way of fighting back was desperately needed.
And right into this incredibly dark moment steps Mahatma Gandhi. He returned to India from South Africa in 1915, and he brought with him a radical new methodology, satyagraha. Now, it's absolutely crucial to understand that Gandhi didn't see this as passive resistance. Not at all. He viewed it as intensely active. The core idea was that if your cause is true, and if you're fighting against injustice, you don't actually need physical force. By completely refusing to cooperate, but doing so totally without violence, you could appeal directly to the conscience of the oppressor. It was this unifying beacon of hope that gave a disarmed population a real way forward.
So, Gandhi turned this philosophy into action through the non-cooperation movement of 1920. And this wasn't just some chaotic riot, right? It was a highly methodical, staged political plan. First step, Indians would surrender any titles awarded by the government. Second step, a massive, systematic boycott of the civil service, the army, the courts, and even foreign goods. People were famously burning imported cloth in these huge bonfires. And finally, the third step, if the government repressed them, they would launch a full-scale civil disobedience campaign. Gandhi's argument was brilliantly simple. He said British rule only survived because Indians cooperated with it. If that cooperation stopped, the empire would collapse.
But here's the reality. Keeping a massive, nationwide movement perfectly nonviolent is incredibly difficult, especially against brutal colonial pushback. And the repression escalated fast. In 1919, the British passed the Rowlatt Act, which basically allowed them to hold political prisoners without a trial. When peaceful protests erupted against it, we saw the horrific Jallianwala Bagh massacre in April 1919. General Dyer literally blocked the exits and fired on an unarmed crowd, killing hundreds. This kind of escalating violence continually threatened Gandhi's nonviolent structure. Fast forward to February 1922 at Chowri Chowra, where a peaceful demonstration turned into a violent clash. Police were killed, and it prompted Gandhi to suddenly pull the plug on the entire non-cooperation movement. But the pushback from the people didn't end there, which led to much more radical actions, like the assembly bombing in 1929. That assembly bombing was carried out by young revolutionaries, most famously Bhagat Singh. You see, a lot of nationalists, particularly the youth, deeply believed that nonviolence just wasn't going to be enough to overthrow a global empire. They formed groups like the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army to directly target symbols of British power. During his trial, Bhagat Singh made it clear he didn't want to glorify violence, but he believed revolution was the inalienable right of mankind. His words were incredibly powerful. To the altar of this revolution we have brought our youth as incense, for no sacrifice is too great. Inqilab Zindabad. They were quite literally willing to offer their lives for the cause.
Moving on to Section 2, Differing Visions of Freedom.
So Gandhi was calling for Swaraj, freedom.
But Swaraj was basically a prism. It meant entirely different things depending on what your everyday struggles looked like. Take the peasants in Awadh, for example. For them, freedom meant an end to forced labor and those incredibly oppressive high rents from local landlords. But then, contrast that with plantation workers over in Assam. They were essentially legally trapped on tea estates. So for them, the grand, sweeping concept of freedom really just meant the right to walk out the gate and go back to their home villages. Both of these groups chanted Gandhi's name, and they both believed his era of self-rule was coming. But they were using his name to legitimize their own very distinct micro-level goals.
And in some places, the way people interpreted Swaraj completely contradicted the official Congress program. Up in the Gudam Hills of Andhra Pradesh, the colonial government had closed off forest areas, totally cutting off the traditional livelihoods of tribal communities. So they revolted. They were led by a really charismatic figure named Alluri Sitaram Raju. Now what's fascinating is that Raju actually praised Gandhi. He told his followers to wear homespun khadi cloth, but he militantly reinterpreted the core message. He claimed that India could only be freed through armed guerrilla warfare, completely rejecting nonviolence. They attacked police stations and fought for their forest rights in ways that the Congress leadership could never, ever formally approve. Which brings us to Section 3, Salt and Civil Disobedience.
By the 1930s, the Great Depression had sent global agricultural prices crashing. The countryside in India was in total turmoil. The movement was fractured, and Gandhi really needed a new, highly relatable symbol to bring everyone back together against the British. And he found it in something incredibly ordinary: salt. 240 miles. Just imagine walking that distance. That was the grueling scale of the 1930 Salt March, from his ashram all the way to the coastal town of Dandi. Why salt? Well, because it's a basic necessity. It was consumed by the absolute richest and the absolute poorest alike. The British held a monopoly on making it, and they taxed it heavily. By marching for 24 days and then illegally boiling seawater to make his own salt, Gandhi brilliantly highlighted the most oppressive everyday face of British rule. It instantly united millions of people across class divides to go out and break colonial laws.
But as the civil disobedience movement actually unfolded, that prism effect we talked about, it came right back. Rich peasant communities were getting hit hard by falling crop prices. So for them, Swaraj was strictly a fight against high colonial revenue rates. When the movement was temporarily called off in 1931 and those rates hadn't dropped, they were incredibly frustrated. Meanwhile, you had prominent Indian industrialists who were heavily funding the movement, but they viewed Swaraj primarily as a way to end colonial trade restrictions and foreign monopolies. So when their specific economic demands weren't being met, or when business was disrupted for just a bit too long, their participation visibly fluctuated.
Let's look at Part 4, the limits of unity.
It wasn't just economics dividing people. Not all social groups were moved by this abstract concept of Swaraj. And that led to some really profound internal clashes. One of the most significant was between Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and Mahatma Gandhi. Dr. Ambedkar organized the Dalits, the historically oppressed castes, and he firmly believed that the only way to resolve their social disabilities was through guaranteed political empowerment. So he demanded separate electorates for Dalits, meaning they could choose their own representatives. Gandhi, however, was strongly opposed to this. He feared that creating separate electorates would permanently divide Indian society and basically halt any process of social integration. This was an intense standoff, but it eventually led to the 1932 Pune Pact. This agreement gave Dalits reserved legislative seats, but they would still be voted in by the general electorate.
At the exact same time, religious divisions were really deepening. After the mid-1920s, a large section of Muslims felt increasingly alienated from the Congress, which they felt was associating more and more with Hindu nationalist groups. The Muslim League was growing really anxious about their status as a minority. Sir Muhammad Iqbal, who was the president of the League in 1930, articulated this incredibly clearly. He argued that you couldn't just apply European-style democracy to India without recognizing communal groups. He stated that the Muslim demand for the creation of a Muslim India within India was perfectly justified to protect their culture from being completely submerged by a Hindu majority. This deep desire to protect minority identity really laid the intellectual groundwork for the eventual demand for Pakistan.
And that brings us to our final section, forging a collective identity. So, if the economic goals were all over the place and the social and political fractures were this deep, how on earth did they stay together at all? Well, the answer is shared cultural symbols. You see, you can't just fight against something. You have to feel like you belong to something. This is quite literally how modern nations are built. Artists started visualizing the nation itself as Bharat Mata, this ascetic, spiritual mother figure that everyday people could emotionally connect with. Nationalists went out touring villages, recording traditional folk tales and songs because they believed this preserved their true, authentic identity from outside corruption. And they designed powerful visual symbols, like the Swaraj tricolor flag with the spinning wheel right in the center. People would hold it aloft during marches, and it became this incredible, unified symbol of defiance. All these cultural touchpoints layered on top of each other, eventually culminating in the massive nationwide Quit India movement of 1942.
Which leaves us with a pretty profound question to chew on. When the British finally left, did India actually achieve a single unified independence? Or, if we look through that historical prism we've been talking about, is it more accurate to say that millions of different freedoms, from the peasants seeking land, to the industrialists seeking trade, to the minorities seeking representation, were all won simultaneously under one collective flag? It's a fascinating way to look at history, and I think it shows just how complex and incredible the making of a modern nation truly is. Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer.